Before we get into today's story, if you're new here, welcome to Crimson Secrets, the place where real life turns out stranger and more brutal than anything you could make up. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. We've had people from all 50 states and more than 80 countries, and we read every single one. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The morning Nathaniel Crow handed his wife divorce papers, she was standing at the kitchen counter in her reading glasses, going over a contract amendment that would, by 4 o'clock that afternoon, make her the single most important person in a $12 billion pharmaceutical negotiation. He didn't know that. He wouldn't know that for another 6 hours. What he did know, or thought he knew, was that he was done. Done with the late nights, done with the empty seat at dinner, done with a woman who, in his words, had chosen a career over a marriage. He set the envelope on the counter next to her coffee mug, and he said, very calmly, "I need you to look at those before you leave." Lyra Weston didn't look up from the contract immediately. She finished reading the paragraph she was on, something about exclusivity windows and regulatory timelines, and then she set the papers down, took off her glasses, and looked at her husband of 9 years. "Okay," she said, "just that. Okay." And Nathaniel Crow, who had rehearsed this moment for 3 weeks, who had imagined her crying or arguing or begging him to reconsider, had absolutely no idea what to do with okay. To understand what happened that Tuesday in March, you have to go back. Not far back, not to the beginning of the marriage, not to the first date, not to the law school where they met. Just back about 4 years, to the moment when everything between them quietly started to come apart at the seams, and neither of them said a word about it until it was too late. Lyra Weston. Lyra Colette Weston, the name her mother had chosen, because she said it sounded like someone who would do great things, had graduated top of her class from Columbia Law, turned down 3 big firm offers, and instead taken a position at a mid-size biotech consultancy in Boston that most of her classmates had never heard of. Her colleagues thought she was underselling herself. Her mother thought she'd lost her mind. Nathaniel, who was 3 years into a junior partnership at a real estate firm downtown, thought she'd come around. Eventually, she didn't come around. She went further in. By the time she was 34, Lyra was the lead regulatory strategist on a licensing deal for a gene therapy compound that had spent 7 years in clinical trials. The science was complicated. The legal architecture around it was more complicated. And the stakes. She had explained this to Nathaniel exactly once. In the car, on the way to his brother's birthday dinner, while he was fiddling with the radio, were significant enough that a single misstep in the contract language could expose the client to liability in 4 different jurisdictions simultaneously. He had found the station he wanted. He turned up the volume. She stopped explaining. That was year 5. By year 7, she had stopped trying to bring him into that part of her life at all, not out of spite. Not out of secrecy, just out of a kind of tired pragmatism. She had learned that certain conversations drained her in ways she couldn't afford, and this was one of them. She worked. He worked. They ate dinner together maybe 4 nights a week. They were polite. They were careful. They were strangers with shared furniture and a joint checking account and a golden retriever named Biscuit, who loved them both without condition or complication. She told herself it was fine. She told herself a lot of things in those years. What she didn't tell herself, what she never let herself sit with long enough to name, was how much it hurt when she came home from a presentation in Geneva to find that Nathaniel had arranged the home office without asking her. When she found her research binders stacked in the garage. When she mentioned, at a dinner party with his colleagues, that she'd been brought in to consult on the Arrowwood case, a regulatory matter that had been front-page news in the industry. And Nathaniel had laughed and said, "She's always working on something I've never heard of," in a tone that was supposed to sound affectionate, but landed somewhere else entirely. His friends had laughed. She had smiled. She was very good at smiling. What she was not good at, what she had never learned, and perhaps should have, was saying, "This is hurting me. This specific thing right now is hurting me, and I need you to see it." Instead, she worked harder. She billed more hours. She took the 6 a.m. calls, so she could be home by 8 and sit across from her husband at breakfast and pretend everything was manageable. And Nathaniel, who was not a cruel man, not fundamentally, not at his core, had looked at the woman across the breakfast table and seen someone who didn't need him, someone who moved through the world at a frequency he couldn't tune into. Someone who had gradually and without apparent grief deprioritized him in every way that mattered. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't know why. And he never asked. That was the thing that Lyra would think about later, in the months after, in the quiet apartment she rented near the Fenway, in the long walks she took with Biscuit along the river on Sunday mornings. He never once asked. Not why are you working so much? Not what is it you're working on? Not is there something you need from me that I'm not giving you? He simply observed the distance between them and concluded that she had created it on purpose. Maybe she had. Maybe they both had. She never quite resolved that question. What she knew for certain was this. On the morning he handed her those divorce papers, she was not surprised. She was not surprised in the way that you're not surprised when it finally rains after weeks of a sky that won't stop threatening, not relief, not devastation, just a kind of recognition. Oh, so this is what this was. She read the documents on the train to the office. She had a system for this. She had a system for most things, and it involved a yellow legal pad and a blue pen, and a habit of annotating anything she read with questions and follow-up items along the margins. The divorce papers got the same treatment. There were 3 things she flagged immediately. The clause about the condo, the language around the retirement accounts, and one line near the bottom added in what appeared to be a last-minute edit, requesting a percentage of any income she earned from contracts signed during the term of the marriage that vested or paid out after the date of dissolution. She underlined it twice. Then she put the cap back on her pen, looked out the window at the city moving past, and thought, he hired someone sharp. She didn't feel angry. She felt, and this was the part she wouldn't be able to explain to anyone for a long time, almost admiring. It was a smart clause. It was precisely the kind of clause she might have suggested in another life, in another context. The fact that it was aimed at her was almost beside the point. Almost. She had a 9 o'clock meeting with the full Arrowwood team. She was the last one to arrive, which was unusual. She was almost always the first. And, when she walked in, portfolio under her arm, coffee in hand, the 7 people already seated at the table looked up with a particular expression that meant something had changed overnight. Vantage pulled out, said Damon Pruitt, her associate, before she'd even set her bag down. He was 28, and had the gift of delivering bad news without drama, which was one of the things she valued most about him. Called Harrison at midnight. They're citing timeline concerns. Lyra set her portfolio on the table. She set her coffee next to it. She sat down. When's the next call with Belcourt? 2 o'clock. Move it to noon. They're in London. I know where they're in. She opened her portfolio. Move it to noon. Tell them we have a revised proposal they need to see before the close of business, their time. Damon wrote something down. The rest of the team was watching her, the way people watch someone dismantle a bomb, with the particular stillness of people who have decided not to interfere. What's the revised proposal? Asked Quentin Aldridge, the senior partner, from the far end of the table. He was 61 years old and had been in this industry for longer than most of the people in the room had been alive, and he had a way of asking questions that made them sound like tests. Lyra looked at him. I've been working on a restructure for the past 3 weeks, she said. In case Vantage got cold feet. The new framework doesn't need them. It needs Belcourt, the Meridian Group, and the letter of intent from the Frankfurt office that we got in January and never formally activated. Quentin was quiet for a moment. You built a contingency. I always build a contingency. You didn't tell anyone. I told you I was working on something, she said. Another silence. How long will it take you to have it ready for noon? She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 9:07. It's already ready, she said. She stepped out at 10:45 to call her sister. This was something she did, had always done, when the pressure reached a certain altitude, not to ask for advice, not to process anything out loud. Just to hear a voice that knew her from before any of this, before the law degree, and the conference rooms and the contracts, with more zeros than most people would see in a lifetime. Her sister Bree lived in Tucson and worked as a middle school art teacher and had once told Lyra, "I genuinely cannot explain to anyone what it is you do for a living," and Lyra had laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. She called her now from the stairwell. "He served me this morning," she said, when Bree picked up. A beat of silence. Then, "Are you okay? I have a noon call that's going to be the most important conversation of my career." "That's not what I asked." Lyra leaned against the wall. The stairwell was cold and smelled faintly of old coffee and something chemical she'd never identified. "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest thing she'd said to another person in a long time. "Ask me at 1 o'clock." Bree laughed, not because it was funny, but because she understood. "I'll be here," she said. "I know you will." She didn't cry, not because crying would have been wrong, but because Lyra had spent so many years operating in rooms where emotion was considered a liability, that she had lost, somewhere along the way, the easy access to it that she'd once had. She remembered crying at her own wedding, not from joy, though there had been joy, but from some complicated mixture of love and fear, and the particular grief of knowing that a chapter was ending even as another began. She had cried at her father's funeral. She had cried the night the Montrose deal fell apart, 3 years ago, alone, in a hotel room in Chicago, from a combination of exhaustion and frustration, and the accumulated weight of 100 things she'd been carrying without help. But she didn't cry on the train reading the divorce papers. She didn't cry in the stairwell on the phone with Bree. And she would not cry later when everything changed, because by the time everything changed, she was too tired to do anything but sit very still and let it wash over her. The noon call with Belcourt ran 47 minutes. Lyra presented the restructured framework with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it in her sleep, because, in some ways, she'd been refining it for 3 weeks, in the margins of other work, in the hotel rooms and the early mornings, and the long Sundays. When Nathaniel played golf, she sat at the kitchen table with her reading glasses and her coffee and the particular silence that had become, without her quite choosing it, the texture of her life. The restructure was elegant. That was the only word for it. It distributed the licensing rights across 3 separate entities in a way that reduced regulatory exposure, accelerated the timeline by approximately 14 months, and, most importantly, created a structure that was independently stable, not contingent on any single partner's participation. When she finished walking them through it, there was a pause of several seconds. Then Hugo Belcourt, who was 73 years old and had seen everything and said very little about any of it, said, "How long have you had this?" 3 weeks. Why didn't you present it sooner?" Because 3 weeks ago, there was still a chance Vantage would hold. Another pause. She could hear the murmur of voices on his end of the line. His team, she assumed, consulting in urgent whispers. "What are you asking for in terms of timeline?" "Letters of intent from all 3 parties by end of business Friday. We move to formal execution next week." The pause this time was longer. "Lyra," he said. He was one of the few people in the industry who called her by her first name without being invited to, and she had never corrected him, because there was something in the way he said it that felt like respect rather than presumption. "If this comes together the way you're describing, it will. You understand what you'll have built." She did understand. She had understood for 3 weeks, alone at that kitchen table, in the quiet that her husband had mistaken for absence and her colleagues had mistaken for focus. She had understood exactly what she was building and why, and what it would mean, and she had not said a word about it to anyone except Damon, and only to Damon because she needed someone to check her math. "I understand," she said. "Then let's talk numbers." By the time the call ended at 12:47, the framework she'd built was the backbone of what would become a $940 million licensing agreement, the largest single biotech licensing deal finalized in New England that year, and one of the largest in the country. By Friday morning, all 3 letters of intent were in. By the following Thursday, it was signed. Lyra didn't learn the final number until late Wednesday afternoon, when Quentin called her into his office and slid a single sheet of paper across his desk. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked up. "I need you to understand something," Quentin said. He was not a sentimental man, but there was something in his voice that she hadn't heard before, not quite warmth, but something adjacent to it. "I've been doing this for 31 years. What you built, the contingency, the restructure, the way you held all of it together, when Vantage pulled out. I've seen very few people do anything like that at any level." She nodded. She didn't know what to say. She rarely didn't know what to say. "Don't thank me," I exclaimed. "I almost told you to drop it and focus on Vantage." "I know you did." He almost smiled. "Go home, Lyra. Whatever that looks like right now." She thought about the apartment, Biscuit, the box of things she needed to pick up from the condo when Nathaniel wasn't there, the yellow legal pad with the annotated divorce papers sitting in her bag, the clause about the post-dissolution income. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." She didn't tell Nathaniel. Not that day, not that week. She signed the divorce papers, after her own attorney removed the post-dissolution clause, and 3 others, and she returned them without a note, without a phone call, without any of the accompanying drama that, she suspected, he had been bracing for. She heard later, through Damon, who had heard it through someone at Nathaniel's firm, that there was a piece in one of the industry publications. Not front page, not splashed, but there, for anyone who was paying attention, a licensing agreement, a number, her name. She didn't know when Nathaniel saw it. She didn't know what he said, or thought, or did, in the moment he put the pieces together. She told herself she didn't care, and she almost believed it, in the way you almost believe things that are mostly true. What she knew was this. She was in her new apartment on a Sunday morning, Biscuit asleep across her feet, a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside her, reading a novel she'd been meaning to read for 2 years. Her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it for a moment, then set it face down on the table. She picked up the novel. Outside, the city went about its business. The river, if you walked far enough to see it, was silver in the morning light. She read 2 more chapters before she got up to make more coffee. There are things that happen to people. The kind of things you can't manufacture, can't engineer, can't plot your way toward, that only make sense in retrospect. The Vantage withdrawal, the midnight phone call that Damon fielded while Lyra was asleep. The 3 weeks of quiet work at a kitchen table while a marriage dissolved around her without anyone quite saying so. She hadn't set out to build something extraordinary. She had set out, as she always did, to solve the problem in front of her, to find the structure that held, to locate the contingency inside the failure, and follow it to wherever it led. It led to this. It led to her name in the trade press, to a number that would have seemed unreal to the 22-year-old version of herself, studying at a library table in Manhattan with a highlighter and a very strong opinion about regulatory frameworks and a whole life still ahead of her that she couldn't yet see. She thought about that girl sometimes, in the early mornings before the calls started, before Damon arrived with whatever was on fire today. She thought about her with something that wasn't quite nostalgia, more like recognition, like looking at a photograph of someone you used to be and thinking, you were right to keep going. Whatever it costs, you were right to keep going. A year after the signing, Lyra was asked to speak at a conference in San Francisco. Industry event, mid-size, the kind of room full of people who had spent their careers building things no one outside their field had ever heard of. She gave a 20-minute talk on regulatory contingency planning. It was not, by any measure, a glamorous subject. But the room was full, and it stayed full, and when she finished, a woman in the second row raised her hand and said, "Can you talk about the moment you knew the restructure would work? Like, what did that feel like internally?" Lyra thought about it. She thought about the kitchen glasses, the cold coffee, the divorce papers with the annotated margins, the stairwell. Bree's voice asking if she was okay, and the honest answer being, "I don't know. Ask me at 1 o'clock. It didn't feel like certainty," she said. It felt like the absence of the alternative. Like I'd looked at every other path and this was the one that was still standing. The woman nodded, like that made sense. It did. Lyra had learned by then that most things that seem complicated from the outside are, At the center, very simple. You look at what's left. You follow it. You do the work in the quiet when nobody's watching, because the work doesn't care who's watching. And then, one day, the room erupts, or the letter of intent arrives, or the number appears on a sheet of paper across someone's desk, and you nod because you knew. Not because you were certain. Because you had built something that was still standing when everything else fell down. That was the only kind of knowing that had ever mattered to her. She carried it forward, into whatever came next.